Hi folks, how are you all doing? This week I wanted to do a video talking about my family's experience with learning disabilities growing up. And I thought this would be a good week to do this since the readings do talk about neuroplasticity, neurology, ADHD, exceptionalities. And I'm not going to go too much into I guess the science behind this, because this experience is from when I was a kid, not as an education professor. I did do a little bit of research for this, and I did actually call my mom to refresh myself on some of the details of this story, because how old was I? I don't know, I think I was like grade 6 or grade 7 when this all started, so it's been a while. But my intention here is to share this story from the perspective of a family member rather than as a professor, and talk about the experience rather than the science. So this really is a story of uninclusive education. Let's start off by talking about what inclusive education is. The Government of Ontario defines inclusive education as education that is based on principles of acceptance and inclusion of all students. And students see themselves reflected in their curriculum, their physical surroundings, and the broader environment in which diversity is honored and all individuals are respected. And this story will not be about that. So this story is really about my brother, and I do have his permission to share this. While I do have my own learning difficulties, particularly with regards to math, that's something that wasn't really recognized when I went through school. So I didn't have people starting to label me as dyscalculia until I was an adult and working in research, but we're not talking about that today. And something else that might be helpful here is to talk about what an exceptionality is. I know I've used the term a few times on some of my videos, and our Reading and Engaging Minds this week also talks about exceptionalities. So the Government of Ontario identifies 5 categories of exceptionalities for exceptional students, and they are behavioral, communicational, intellectual, physical, and multiple. And these are meant to be really broad to address a very wide range of conditions that a learner could have in a classroom. And this is also meant to be inclusive of all medical conditions, regardless of whether or not they are diagnosed. And while I do use the term exceptionalities, to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of that term. In Engaging Minds, the authors talk a little bit about how it is in reference to students that differ from the norm. So if we're thinking about our standard deviation curve again, we're talking about the outliers kind of thing. So I'm not a huge fan of that term, but I have yet to find another term within the literature that is as expansive to cover a variety of things like learning disabilities, autism, medical conditions, giftedness, things like that. I don't know. I struggle with it. If anyone comes across a better term for it, please let me know. So, on to my brother. So my brother falls under the umbrella of having a communication exceptionality. And the first sign was really, I remember as a kid, he had some speech issues. I remember something was that he couldn't pronounce my name properly. He had a really hard time with Rachel. I can't remember if it was the CH or the L or what it is. It was so long ago. I just remember my name was one of the things that was hard for him. He also was having a really tough time learning how to read. But for kindergarten in grade 1, aside from some delays and difficulties with speech, he was fine. His grade 1 teacher, I remember, also used sign language when they were learning how to spell. And he was in a 1-2 split, so he often sat with a lot of the older kids who mentored him, so we really didn't have any issues at that point. Although my mom did spend a lot of time with my brother at home working on his reading, doing flashcards and things like that. I remember them lying in bed, and my mom would trace out the letters of the words on the ceiling. So we knew something was up, but we didn't know what exactly at this point. And then grade 2 is where things really went downhill. So he'd been placed in the lowest level reading group, which obviously was very upsetting for him and his self-esteem. But he had really great reading comprehension, so what he could read, he understood really well. But he was struggling, and the teachers thought my brother was dumb. And they were also pulling him from class to see a speech-language pathologist, who my brother called the La-La lady, because I guess L's was something he had a problem with at that time, and they just spent a lot of time going la, 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 la. And meanwhile, he was doing piano lessons, which is actually really, really critical to this story. Because while we had the teachers on one hand saying that my brother was dumb, we had his piano teacher saying that he was really bright and he was really gifted, and he could pick up music no problem, and he'd play a song a few times and he'd have it memorized. So my mom was like, okay, well, there's something going on here, because there's clearly a huge disconnect between what the school's saying and what the music teacher is saying. But like I said, meanwhile, the teachers were saying the opposite of our music teacher. So I remember in grade 2, they told my parents that my brother would never read beyond a grade 3 level. And then there's some sort of, I don't know if she was a special education teacher or what she was, but it was one of the people who was pulling him from class to work with him. And then she told my parents that my brother would end up having troubles with the law, because that's just how these things go. So they decided he needed to see the psychologist at the school to do some testing. And shout out to all of my counseling psychology students. Y'all are great. And I know they did some tests. I'm not sure what exactly they did. I think one of them was an IQ test. Not 100% sure. I was like grade 6 at this point, so who knows. But what I do remember is that what all their testing came back with saying that my brother, like the piano teacher said, was extremely bright. And he ended up being labeled as having a severe learning disability, which I don't know if they still use that term anymore, but at the time, at least, what it meant was that there was a so many point difference between what his potential was and how he was actually performing in the classroom. So based on this, the psychologist recommended my brother undergo some more testing, specifically with his hearing. And while we did do some basic ones, like, to check how well his ears were functioning, specifically, they wanted to look at how he heard different tones and tones in sequence and things like that. So the psychologist recommended someone private outside of the school for this testing, because the kind of testing that he thought my brother needed wasn't something that was just offered for free through the school. So we did this, and based on this, we found out that my brother has an auditory processing disorder, or as it sometimes is also called, a central auditory processing disorder. And what this really comes down to is the ears and the brain not being well coordinated, so it impacts how the brain is interpreting the sound. So it's not necessarily that the person can't hear the sound. In fact, often this person's hearing is fine. It's just how the brain is understanding and interpreting the sounds. So at the time when I was a kid, I remember they explained it to me as being like an auditory dyslexia, because I knew what dyslexia was at that time. But it is more complicated than that, because it's not like with dyslexia, the brain isn't just like swapping around sounds and things like that, but that's how they explained it to me. So quite often, because a lot of these people, their hearing is okay otherwise, if you're delivering sounds one tone at a time, they can hear it just fine. But a lot of times what will happen is if it's a really noisy environment, or it's certain tones and sequences, then they can't hear something. So in my brother's case, if you have a really high tone followed by a really low tone, he can't hear the high tone. So as you can imagine, things like a noisy classroom can be really problematic. I remember my brother really hated going to school and just noisy, loud environments in general. So he hated going to movies, even though he's really into music and he's now a drummer. He hated concerts because he didn't like how loud they were. And he also had issues, of course, with his speech and reading, which is a symptom of auditory processing disorder. So based on this, the person who did the testing recommended that my brother get an FM system for in the classroom so he could better hear the teacher. And when my parents approached the school to tell them about the diagnosis that we had now and some of the recommendations that had been made, the teachers did not respond well. They accused my parents of jumping the queue by going and getting private testing done, even though their school psychologist recommended this person and specifically said to get this kind of testing. They also accused the person who did the testing of just being guilty of trying to make my parents buy an FM system that they didn't need. So my parents were pretty mad. And at this point, my mom realized that within the school, no one was communicating with each other. So the teachers, the principal, the vice principal, the school psychologist, no one was talking to each other and no one had any idea what was going on. So my mom started writing a lot of letters, and she would just like CC everyone on everything, so there was no excuse. And at this point, my parents decided to pull him from the speech language pathology that was going on in the school. The reason being that at this point, it really wasn't going to help. So my mom's way of explaining this was that sending him into an SLP was like dealing with a child who's colorblind by just turning up the lights really bright. Like they still can't see it. And like in my brother's case, that's nice if they want to sit there and make him say la, 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 la over and over again, but he can't hear the sound. So we needed to change our tactics and work on things that were going to help him hear better. Now, that's not to say that we completely stopped with speech language therapy for my brother. However, the approach that my parents did was they started working with a private SLP outside of the school who was more into the neurology side of things. So he started doing this program called Fast Forward, which is a computer program that helps children learn how to read. And it's really great for kids like my brother. So here in Fast Forward, they focus more on learning phonetics rather than the whole language approach that they often do in English class. And the Fast Forward people described the program to my parents as it being like putting on glasses for his ears. And my mom said it was really obvious, like what tones he could and couldn't hear when he was doing these activities. And spoiler alert, the program worked really well for my brother, but that's not to say it wasn't really difficult on our family. For my brother, it was a really intensive program. And he had to do it every single day, which I found frustrating because he started it over the summer, which means we couldn't go on vacations. I think we went away for one weekend for a couple of days, and that was that. We didn't have laptops then, so we had to stay home. And it was also very intensive and frustrating for my brother, especially when he was about to have a breakthrough and be able to hear a sound, because he would know that there was a sound there that he was missing out on, and he'd get really frustrated because he knew it was there, but he couldn't quite hear it yet. But over time, he did improve, and actually within a few months, he was reading at a grade 3 level, so his teachers were wrong. So come the fall, my mom wanted to continue with Fast Forward, because we had seen with just one session of it, it was working really well for him. and she wanted to continue on with it. And so we did that for the fall while he continued with regular schooling, which was really difficult for him because he was going to school for 6 hours and then having to do this other program as well. That was really intensive. But I mean, we were trudging along, doing all right, and until my parents found out that the school was going behind their back and still sending him to speech language pathology. Although at this point, they weren't even sending him to a speech language pathologist. It was just, I don't know what this person's credentials were, but they were not an SLP. And they were still pulling him from class, which was, of course, very disruptive for my brother, and it really upset him. And we found out one day because my mom was going through my brother's backpack, and she found some worksheets that were talking about ladybugs and things like that, and she recognized them from the time when he was with the SLP. So she was not happy, to say the least. So my parents had already been kind of looking into homeschooling and things like that. My mom had already been to a convention, and she decided that they wanted to do some component of learning at home with him so he could do, say, fast forward in the morning and then go to school in the afternoon for things like phys ed and music and things like that. And they were very willing to work with the school, but the school was not willing to work with them. So ultimately, my parents over the Christmas break decided that they were going to pull my brother from public school. And my mother's rationale was that she was pretty confident that we could get my brother reading a heck of a lot faster than the teachers would be able to at this point. So my brother was homeschooled for a few years, and he thrived doing homeschooling. And actually, we both did homeschooling for a little bit. He initially did it for half of grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5, and then he went back to public school for 2 years. And then he chose to do homeschooling for high school. And I also did homeschooling for grade 12, and I loved it. So the way we did it was more in line with how they do education in the Finnish schools. So we did school in the morning. We were able to get through everything we needed to get through in the morning. And then in the afternoon was dedicated to activities. So we both took a lot of music lessons. By that point, I was working at the pool. So a lot of times, either in the afternoon, I would either be at music lessons or practicing, or I would be at the pool. And in my brother's case, he did a mix of a lot of different things. We were both registered through a school, so we did have teachers, we did all of our stuff at a distance. He also did things like a homeschool gym class where he got together with other homeschoolers and they did phys ed together. He did a lot of volunteer work, especially at the YMCA. He did some online courses, some paper-based distance courses, meetups with other homeschool families, and my parents were really able to target the curriculum to things that would help him. So like another thing he struggled with was printing, so my parents got him doing handwriting instead and got him doing a lot of different skills that would help him with his fine motor skills. Like in, I think, grade 4 or grade 5, he made a button blanket, and so every day he would sew buttons onto his blanket to work on those fine motor skills. And then he went back for grade 6 and 7, and my parents sent him to a different school, not the one he originally went to, because there was no way he was going back to that first one. And he had a fabulous experience there. The vice principal, who was also his teacher, was absolutely fantastic. It was the first time he had an individual education plan, or an IEP, which is something that all children with exceptionalities are, well, not even just supposed to have, they have to have them. And so an IEP is a written plan describing the special education program and or services that are required by that particular student. And it includes a record of the accommodations that they need in order to help them achieve their learning expectations. And like I said, all children who have some type of exceptionality have to have an IEP. And so this new school worked on this in collaboration with my parents, and ultimately the IEP that they came up with was do nothing. Leave him alone. My parents really wanted him to have a positive experience at school after the not so positive experience he had at the previous school. So the tentative plan was just to let him do his thing, and as things came up, they would address them. And if they needed to go back in and revise the IEP and make it very specific, they would do so. Like I said, they really wanted him to have a positive experience because at the time they pulled him, initially he had a lot of anxiety surrounding going to school, so he would have like an upset stomach every day. And by the end of grade 2, he thought he was stupid, a courtesy of his teachers. So that was something that my family and his subsequent teachers and our music teacher all spent a really long time trying to unteach him. He also developed a lot of allergies around this time. He developed some mild Tourette's. And it's hard to say, of course, if this is actually a result of this situation, but our physician wasn't willing to rule it out at this point. And so overall, now he's doing really well. There are still some things he can't hear well, and he does have some hearing problems with one of his ears. So like if he talks on the phone, like he uses his good ear and stuff like that. He also has to work really hard to listen, so sometimes he gets listening fatigue. Especially at the end of the day. So a good way to describe what listening fatigue is thinking about speaking in another language. So while I know a little bit of French, although it's not great and I probably offend a lot of people when I try to speak in French, but I find sometimes when I'm trying to speak in French or write in French and really think in French, I get very fatigued very quickly, and then just like my brain starts tuning out and I just can't do it. So like at U Ottawa, a lot of times I will go to little talks and conferences that are in French to try and improve my French, but after a certain time, like my brain just can't anymore. And this is the way it works for my brother too. So sometimes at the end of the day, he's very tired from trying to focus so hard and listen, and he will just tune out whatever you're saying. So he kind of has the superpower of being able to like actually tune people out and not listening. Now, we were really fortunate in all this experience that we had the means for my mom to be able to stay home with my brother and homeschool him, that my family could afford a private SLP and all this additional testing, because of course not all families can do this. We also had a really, really great support network, of course, outside of that school. Was not the teachers that were helping us. So some really important people in this were, of course, the school psychologist. He was hugely important in all of this. The private SLP, the piano teacher who first, helped us see that there was a discrepancy between what my brother was capable of and what was going on at the school. And my mom's two closest friends, one of whom is a speech-language pathologist herself and the other is a teacher. Our friend who is a speech-language pathologist was a really great support for my mom, and she would send her things like journal articles and things like that to help her educate herself on this. And the friend who was a teacher was also super supportive, especially how laid back she was. I think that really calmed my mom. So for example, when deciding whether or not to pull my brother from school, she was just it's fine. If you change your mind, you can always put him back in. It's not a big deal. And when we decided to put him back in grade 6, she was just put him back in, see how it goes. Make it a safe place to fail. And if you need to pull him again, just pull him again. You can change your mind. So that attitude was very calming for my mom, especially hearing it come from a teacher. And I asked my mom when we were talking about this the other day on the phone if there's anything she would do differently in retrospect. And the only thing she said she would change is that she would have pulled him out of school much sooner. And she also wanted me to include a disclaimer here that while homeschooling worked really well for us, it's not for everyone. It really depends on the family, it depends on your context, your teachers, and of course it depends on the child. It worked well for us, but it may not work well for other people. She's also a really big fan of Montessori schools, which you should check out. And this whole experience is probably the single most influential thing in my teaching philosophy. Through it, I've seen how much education impacts the whole family and the importance of a family's role in a child's education. I mean, who knows what would have happened to my brother had my mom not pushed so much and been so involved and advocated for my brother? Would their prediction of him not being able to read past a grade 3 level and having problems with the law have come true? And this also showed me the importance of being flexible in my approach to teaching and being accommodating. So while I'm really into things influenced by complexity science in my teaching, like enabling constraints, my interest in these things really comes from this experience of having a brother who has a severe learning disability, because I really want to have a classroom where students with exceptionalities aren't exceptional, if that kind of makes sense. So I want to make for a classroom environment and for assignments and things that students have enough flexibility in so they can make it work for them. So they're not just, the exception in the class, but they're just part of the classroom collective. And that's why I offer different assignment modalities. For example, the option to, you can write a paper, you can do a video, you can do a podcast, you can do an infographic. I try to make it so people can work with what they need, and why I take the time to do things like subtitling all of my videos, regardless of whether or not I have a learner in my class who requires closed captioning. And that's all for now, folks. I was going to say I hope you found this video helpful like I usually do, but I guess this one isn't so much a matter of being helpful. I guess it's more so, I don't know, I hope you were inspired. I hope it illustrated to you the importance of inclusive classrooms and thinking about students with exceptionalities and the importance of integrating these things when you are planning your classes and when you're teaching. If you have any questions about this or my family's experience, please do let me know. I'm more than happy to field questions. Yeah, that's all for now. Thanks for listening.